There's nothing quite like losing everything you thought your life would be, then discovering that sometimes the most broken places hold the greatest gifts. When Leif, a weathered Viking who'd watched his dreams sink like ships in a storm, inherited a crumbling house from an uncle no one ever talked about. He figured it was just another disappointment waiting to happen. The longhouse sat half-sunken in the Norwegian marshlands, abandoned and forgotten. All that waited for him, there was a thin, quiet dog with tired eyes that seemed to understand failure. At first, they were just two lost souls sharing hunger and cold nights. But then the dog started acting strange, pawing desperately at the muddy ground behind the house. What it uncovered was a buried chest filled with silver coins and treasures worth over $2 million. But the real mystery wasn't the gold itself. Why had this lonely dog been guarding such a secret for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived on the coldest morning of winter, carried by a messenger who looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else in the 9 realms. Leif had been mending nets in his cramped hut when the knock came, a sound so unexpected it made his weathered hands freeze on the rope. For 3 seasons, no one had visited him. Why would they? His last raid had been a disaster that cost good men their lives and brought home nothing but shame. He remembered unfolding the parchment with fingers stiff from cold and failure. The words were written in a careful hand, formal and distant. Leif Erikson, son of Magnus the Bold, you are hereby informed of your inheritance following the death of your uncle, Bjorn the Recluse. The property consists of 1 longhouse and accompanying lands in the marshes of Vestfold, along with all possessions therein. Uncle Bjorn. The name had always been spoken in whispers, if spoken at all. Leif's father had mentioned him perhaps 3 times in 30 years, and always with a darkness that settled over his face like storm clouds. My brother chose a different path, was all Magnus would ever say, his jaw tightening as if the words themselves tasted bitter. Different path indeed. While Magnus had built a reputation as an honorable warrior and successful trader, Bjorn had simply vanished one winter when Leif was barely walking. Family gatherings never included him. Wedding celebrations, funeral rites, seasonal festivals. Bjorn's absence had become so complete that younger cousins didn't even know he existed. The journey to claim his inheritance had taken 4 days through landscape that grew more desolate with each mile. Leif's small boat struggled against currents that seemed determined to turn him back, and his meager supplies dwindled faster than expected. By the 3rd day, he was sharing his last dried fish with Astrid, his aging mare, who looked as skeptical about this venture as he felt. The marshlands of Vestfold stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of channels and small islands covered in mist that never seemed to lift. Ancient trees, gnarled and bent by centuries of harsh weather, emerged from the water like the twisted fingers of sleeping giants. The air itself felt different here, heavier, laden with secrets and the weight of untold years. When Leif first spotted the longhouse, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The structure seemed to grow directly from the marsh itself, its dark wood blending so completely with the surrounding environment that distinguishing where building ended and wilderness began became impossible. Half of the foundation had settled into the soft ground over the years, giving the entire structure a tired, defeated appearance that reminded Leif uncomfortably of his own recent circumstances. The roof sagged in several places, and moss covered the lower walls like a green shroud. Windows that had once welcomed light now stared out like hollow, empty sockets. A small dock, partially submerged and rotting, extended into the murky water, where Leif tied his boat with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from cold or apprehension, he couldn't say. It was then he saw the dog. The animal sat perfectly still on what remained of the front steps, watching Leif's approach with an intensity that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. It was thin, too thin, with a coat that had once been golden but now carried the dullness of poor nutrition and hard living. Its eyes, though, held an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if this creature understood far more about the world than any dog had a right to know. They regarded each other in silence for several long moments. The dog made no move to approach or retreat, simply observed with those knowing eyes while Leif gathered his courage to step onto the creaking dock. Even Astrid seemed subdued, her usual snorting and stamping replaced by an unusual quiet that made the marsh feel even more isolated. Inside the longhouse, dust motes danced in shafts of pale light that struggled through grimy windows. The air smelled of abandonment, damp wood, old smoke, and something else Leif couldn't quite identify. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, its cold ashes speaking of fires that had warmed no one for years. Rough-hewn furniture remained exactly where Uncle Bjorn had left it, as if he'd simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned. On the heavy oak table sat Uncle Bjorn's personal effects, untouched by time or weather thanks to the sealed environment. A simple wooden cup, worn smooth by years of use. A bone-handled knife with intricate carvings that Leif recognized as family work, his grandfather's distinctive style. A small leather pouch containing a few silver coins, enough for basic needs but hardly a fortune. Most intriguing was a collection of small carved figures arranged along the windowsill. Ravens, wolves, bears, and ships. Each piece showed the skill of someone who understood both wood and the creatures he carved. These weren't mere decorations, but seemed to carry meaning, perhaps representing important moments or people from Uncle Bjorn's mysterious life. The dog had followed him inside without invitation, padding silently across the wooden floor to settle near the cold hearth. It watched Leif's every movement with those penetrating eyes, never begging or demanding attention, but maintaining a presence that suggested deep loyalty to something or someone. As the afternoon light began to fade, Leif made his first attempt to coax warmth from the ancient hearth. The dog observed his struggles with what he could swear was amusement, making no effort to help, but seeming to approve of his eventual success. When small flames finally caught and began pushing back the chill, both man and dog drew closer to the welcome heat. That first night, they shared a sparse meal of dried meat and hard bread. Leif's traveling rations stretched to feed two. The dog accepted the offered food with dignity rather than desperate hunger, as if maintaining some standard of behavior even in these reduced circumstances. They slept on opposite sides of the hearth, neither trusting nor hostile, simply two survivors recognizing a temporary alliance born of necessity. Outside, the marsh settled into its nighttime rhythms. Water lapped against the sunken foundation with gentle persistence. Nightbirds called to each other across the darkness, and somewhere in the distance something large moved through the channels, creating ripples that caught the moonlight like scattered coins. Leif lay on Uncle Bjorn's simple bed, staring at the rough ceiling beams and wondering what chain of events had led him to this moment. 3 months ago, he'd been planning another raid, convinced that his luck would finally turn. Now he found himself the unlikely inheritor of a mystery he didn't understand, sharing shelter with a dog who seemed to know far more about this place than he did. The answers, he suspected, lay buried somewhere in Uncle Bjorn's past, a past that his family had worked so hard to forget. The third morning dawned grey and damp, like all the others in this forsaken marsh. Leif had spent the previous 2 days taking inventory of Uncle Bjorn's meager possessions and trying to decide whether this inheritance was worth the effort of staying. The longhouse needed extensive repairs, the nearest settlement was days away, and his provisions wouldn't last much longer. The sensible thing would be to salvage what he could carry and return to civilization, such as it was. But the dog had other plans. Leif first noticed the change in behavior when he stepped outside to relieve himself in the pre-dawn darkness. Instead of following him as had become routine, the dog remained behind the house, making soft whimpering sounds that carried an urgency he'd never heard before. When Leif called to him, the animal looked up briefly, then immediately returned to pawing at the muddy ground with desperate intensity. "What's gotten into you, old friend?" Leif muttered, using the term of address that had gradually replaced his initial wariness. The dog barely acknowledged him, continuing to dig with single-minded determination that seemed almost frantic. At first, Leif dismissed it as typical dog behavior. Perhaps the animal had caught the scent of some burrowing creature, or discovered where Uncle Bjorn had buried kitchen scraps. But as the morning progressed and the digging continued, something about the dog's persistence began to nag at him. This wasn't playful or driven by hunger. This was purposeful, methodical, as if the dog knew exactly what it was looking for. By midday, the hole had grown deeper than Leif would have thought possible for a single animal to manage. The dog's golden coat was now caked with mud, its paws bloody from scraping against stones and roots, yet it showed no signs of stopping. If anything, its efforts seemed to intensify as the hours passed. "You'll dig yourself to the underworld at this rate," Leif observed, settling down nearby with a piece of dried fish. The dog paused long enough to accept the offered food, then immediately returned to its excavation. Whatever drove this behavior went beyond normal canine instincts. Curious, despite himself, Leif began to examine the area more carefully. The spot the dog had chosen seemed random at first glance, a patch of muddy ground, perhaps 20 paces behind the longhouse, indistinguishable from the surrounding marsh. But as he looked more closely, subtle differences emerged. The vegetation here grew differently, sparser and somehow more deliberate in its arrangement. The ground itself felt different underfoot, more solid than the surrounding wetland. "Someone's been here before, haven't they?" he asked the dog, who paused in its digging long enough to fix him with those intelligent eyes. For a moment, Leif could swear the animal nodded before returning to its work. Intrigued now, Leif fetched a shovel from Uncle Bjorn's modest collection of tools. If the dog was determined to dig, he might as well help speed the process. Working together, they made rapid progress through the soft earth. The dog seemed to approve of his assistance, occasionally stepping back to let Leif take over the deeper excavation while it rested. It was late afternoon when the shovel struck something that definitely wasn't stone or root. The metallic clang echoed across the marsh, causing both diggers to freeze. Leif carefully scraped away more earth, revealing a corner of what appeared to be a wooden chest bound with iron bands. His heart began beating faster, not with excitement, but with a sudden, inexplicable sense of foreboding. "Well, old friend," he said softly to the dog, "it seems you knew exactly what you were looking for." The chest was larger than expected, requiring significant effort to excavate completely. As more of it emerged from the earth, Leif could see that it had been carefully wrapped in oiled leather before burial, protecting it from the moisture that dominated this environment. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to preserve whatever lay inside. With the dog watching intently, Leif managed to drag the chest from its muddy grave. It was surprisingly heavy, and he could hear things shifting inside when he moved it, the distinctive sound of metal against metal, with occasional duller thuds that suggested other materials. The lock appeared to be broken, or perhaps had never been locked at all. Taking a deep breath, Leif lifted the lid. Even in the pale afternoon light, the contents gleamed with an intensity that made him gasp. Silver coins filled the bottom of the chest in neat stacks, their surfaces bright despite their obvious age. Scattered among them were pieces of jewelry, arm rings, brooches, and necklaces that spoke of wealth and status. A drinking horn with silver fittings lay beside an ornate dagger whose blade still held a mirror finish, but it was the sheer quantity that took his breath away. This wasn't the modest savings of a careful man, or even the profits from a successful trading venture. This represented wealth beyond anything Leif had ever seen in one place. More silver than most jarls possessed, more treasure than successful raiders brought home from years of profitable ventures. His hands shook as he lifted a handful of coins, feeling their weight and examining their markings. Some bore the stamps of distant kingdoms, others showed symbols he didn't recognize. These weren't recently minted pieces but ancient wealth, gathered over many years from sources across the known world. The dog sat perfectly still throughout this examination, watching Leif's reactions with those knowing eyes. There was no excitement in the animal's demeanor, no satisfaction at finally revealing its secret. If anything, the dog seemed almost sad, as if this moment represented the end of something important rather than a joyful discovery. Where did he get all this? Leif whispered more to himself than to his canine companion. What was Uncle Bjorn involved in? As if in answer to his questions, the dog rose and padded to a different spot, several paces away, where it began pawing at the ground with renewed purpose. Leif's stomach dropped as he realized the implications. This wasn't the only cache. The questions multiplied faster than he could process them. How long had Uncle Bjorn been accumulating this wealth? Why had he buried it, rather than using it to improve his living conditions? And most disturbing of all, where had it come from? The amount suggested activities that went far beyond honest trading or even typical raiding. This represented systematic acquisition of wealth over many years. Looking at the fortune spread before him, Leif realized that his simple inheritance had transformed into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. In the space of a few hours, he'd gone from owning nothing but a crumbling house to possessing wealth that could change his entire life. But as he watched the dog begin digging at its second location, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the marsh's perpetual dampness. Wealth this substantial always came with complications, and those complications usually involved people who would kill to possess it. The dog had revealed its first secret. Somehow Leif suspected this was only the beginning. That evening, Leif sat by the hearth with the contents of the chest spread across Uncle Bjorn's heavy oak table. Each piece seemed to tell a story he couldn't quite decipher. Intricate brooches that had once adorned noble women, arm rings that had marked the status of powerful warriors, drinking vessels that had graced the tables of wealthy jarls. The craftsmanship was exceptional, representing the finest work from across the known world, but it was the small carved stone he'd found at the bottom of the chest that captured his attention most completely. Unlike the precious metals and gems surrounding it, this piece appeared almost crude at first glance. A flat piece of dark granite covered in what looked like random scratches. Yet something about those markings nagged at him, stirring memories from his childhood. The dog lay nearby, watching his examination with patient interest. Occasionally, it would lift its head when Leif picked up a particular piece, as if certain items held special significance. When he touched the carved stone, the dog's ears perked up noticeably. "You recognize this, don't you?" Leif asked softly. "What is it trying to tell me?" As he studied the markings more carefully by firelight, patterns began to emerge. These weren't random scratches, but deliberate carvings. Runes, he realized, though worked in an archaic style that made them difficult to read. His father had taught him the basics of runic writing, but these symbols seemed older, more complex than the straightforward marks used for simple messages. Gradually, individual runes became clear. There, that was the symbol for journey or voyage. Next to it, something that might represent wealth or treasure. But the grammar connecting them remained elusive, and several symbols defied his limited knowledge entirely. The dog rose and padded over to where Leif sat, resting its chin on the table near the stone tablet. For a moment, man and animal studied the cryptic message together, both clearly understanding that this small piece of carved granite held keys to much larger mysteries. "I wish you could speak," Leif murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "I suspect you know exactly what Uncle Bjorn was trying to say." As if responding to his comment, the dog moved to a wooden chest in the corner that Leif had assumed contained nothing more interesting than old clothes or household items. The animal sat beside it and whined softly, fixing Leif with that penetrating stare that had become so familiar. Inside the chest, beneath layers of moth-eaten wool blankets, Leif discovered more of Uncle Bjorn's secrets. A collection of smaller carved stones, each bearing different runic inscriptions, maps drawn on pieces of hide, showing coastlines and landmarks he recognized from his own travels. And most intriguingly, what appeared to be detailed drawings of ships, not longships like those used for raiding, but broader vessels designed for heavy cargo. One map in particular caught his attention. The coastline was unmistakably that of the Danish kingdoms, with various locations marked by small symbols. Some bore the rune for gold, others showed symbols he was beginning to associate with take or acquire. A chill ran through him as he realized what he might be looking at: a raider's chart, marking locations for profitable attacks. But something about the drawings didn't align with typical raiding practices. The ships were wrong, for one thing, and the locations marked seemed more focused on isolated settlements than on the wealthy monasteries and trading centers that attracted most Viking attention. These looked like the plans of someone who preferred to avoid notice rather than strike fear into his enemies' hearts. The dog watched his examination with increasing intensity, occasionally moving to indicate particular items that seemed important. When Leif unfolded a larger hide map showing what appeared to be the local marshlands, the animal became noticeably agitated, pawing at specific locations marked on the rough chart. "More burial sites?" Leif asked, tracing the marked spots with his finger. The dog's tail wagged once, a motion so brief he might have imagined it. But somehow he was certain it represented agreement. As the night wore on, a picture of Uncle Bjorn began to emerge that was both fascinating and troubling. The maps, the detailed planning, the systematic approach to acquiring wealth, all pointed to someone who had organized his activities with careful precision over many years. But the choice of targets and the careful attention to avoiding populated areas suggested someone who preferred stealth to open confrontation more. Disturbing were the childhood memories that these discoveries triggered. Conversations half overheard when adults thought children weren't listening. Whispers about family shame and choices that couldn't be undone. References to a brother who had lost his way and could never return to honorable society. Leif's father had been a respected warrior who built his reputation through fair dealing and honest combat. If Uncle Bjorn had chosen a different path, what exactly had that path involved? The evidence suggested activities that went beyond simple raiding into something more systematic and secretive. The rune stone continued to puzzle him most of all. Unlike the maps and drawings, which seemed clearly related to planning expeditions, this piece felt more personal. The runes were carved with obvious care, as if the message they contained held deep importance for whoever might eventually read them. Working by firelight, Leif slowly began to piece together fragments of meaning. Journey, wealth, and what might be family or blood. Another symbol that could represent duty or obligation. And near the end, runes that seemed to spell out something like worthy heir or rightful successor. "He left this for someone," Leif said aloud, causing the dog's ears to perk up again. "But who, me? Someone else in the family?" The dog rose and walked to the door, looking back at Leif with obvious expectation. Outside, full darkness had settled over the marsh, but the animal's behavior suggested urgency that couldn't wait for morning. With growing curiosity overcoming his caution, Leif gathered a torch and followed his canine guide into the night. The dog led him directly to the spot where they'd made their afternoon discovery. But instead of stopping there, it continued to a location perhaps 50 paces away. Here it began the same purposeful pawing that had revealed the first treasure cache. "More?" Leif asked, though he already knew the answer. The dog's behavior left no doubt. Uncle Bjorn's wealth extended far beyond what they'd already uncovered. As he began digging by torchlight, questions multiplied in his mind. How much had his uncle hidden? How long had this accumulation been going on? And most importantly, what had driven a man to bury such fortune rather than use it to live comfortably? By the time he'd excavated the second cache, smaller than the first but containing equally impressive treasures, dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. As he carried the new discovery back to the longhouse, Leif realized that his inheritance had transformed yet again. This wasn't just unexpected wealth. It was the legacy of someone who had lived an entirely secret life, leaving behind mysteries that would take considerable time and effort to unravel. The dog settled by the hearth, as if satisfied with the night's work. But Leif remained wide awake, staring at the growing collection of silver and wondering what other secrets lay buried in the marsh around Uncle Bjorn's hidden refuge. The morning brought both clarity and new complications. With better light streaming through the longhouse windows, Leif could examine the hide maps more carefully, and what he discovered made his stomach tighten with apprehension. One particular fragment showed unmistakable landmarks he recognized from his childhood, the distinctive double peaks that marked the approach to his home settlement. The river bend, where his father's trading post had stood. Even the sacred grove where his family conducted seasonal rituals. Uncle Bjorn had been watching them. For how long and why remained unclear, but the detailed mapping of their territory suggested surveillance that had lasted years. Worse, several locations near their family holdings were marked with symbols that Leif was beginning to associate with acquisition and treasure. The dog seemed to sense his growing unease, padding over to rest its head against his knee in what felt like an attempt at comfort. But even this loyal companion's presence couldn't ease the troubling implications of what he was discovering. If Uncle Bjorn had been involved in activities targeting their own people, it would explain the family's silence about his existence. "What did you do, old man?" Leif whispered, tracing the familiar landmarks with his finger. "What made you turn against your own blood?" His contemplation was interrupted by a sound that had become increasingly rare in this isolated marsh, the splash of oars cutting through water. The dog's head snapped up immediately, ears alert and body tense with sudden wariness. Through the grimy window, Leif could see a small boat approaching through the morning mist, carrying two figures who moved with the confident rhythm of experienced watermen. Quickly, he began gathering the most obvious treasures from the table, stuffing silver coins and jewelry back into their hiding places with hands that trembled slightly from urgency rather than fear. The maps and rune stones he rolled up and secured in Uncle Bjorn's leather satchel. Whatever these visitors wanted, he had no intention of revealing what he'd discovered. The dog positioned itself near the door, not aggressively, but with clear intent to observe and protect. Its behavior suggested these weren't the first unexpected visitors to Uncle Bjorn's refuge, and that such visits hadn't always been welcome. The knock came as Leif finished concealing the last of the silver. "Ho there?" called a voice rough with age and weather. "Anyone home? We saw smoke from your chimney." Opening the door, Leif found himself facing two men who looked every bit as weathered and dangerous as their voices suggested. The elder, grey-bearded and missing his left eye, wore the kind of scarred leather armor that spoke of many battles. His companion, younger but equally hard-looking, kept his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "I'm Thorvald," the elder said, his single eye taking in every detail of Leif's appearance. "This is my son Eric. We knew the man who lived here, Bjorn the Recluse. Heard he'd passed on. He was my uncle," Leif replied carefully. "I've inherited the property." Something shifted in Thorvald's expression, not quite disappointment, but perhaps recalculation. "Your uncle, was he? Interesting. Bjorn never mentioned having family." "They weren't close," Leif said, which was certainly true enough. Eric stepped forward slightly, his youth making him less subtle than his father. "Your uncle owed us money. Quite a bit, actually. We've come to collect." The dog's low growl provided counterpoint to this claim, drawing both visitors' attention. Thorvald studied the animal with obvious recognition. "Still here, is he? That's Bjorn's dog, all right. Loyal creature. Your uncle trained him well." The older man's tone carried implications that Leif didn't like. "Perhaps the dog knows where Bjorn kept his valuables. Dogs have good memories for such things." "I'm afraid there weren't many valuables," Leif lied smoothly. "Uncle Bjorn seemed to live quite simply. A few silver coins, some basic household items, hardly enough to pay significant debts." Father and son exchanged glances that spoke of long partnership in activities that probably weren't entirely legal. Thorvald's smile held no warmth. "Oh, but you see, Bjorn wasn't quite the simple hermit he appeared. Our business arrangements with him were quite profitable for all parties involved." He had a talent for finding things that others had lost, if you understand my meaning. Leif understood perfectly, and the knowledge settled in his stomach like cold stones. Uncle Bjorn hadn't been working alone. These men represented connections to a larger network, people who knew about his activities and expected them to continue. The isolation that had made this marsh refuge perfect for hiding also made it an ideal place for conducting business that couldn't bear scrutiny. I'm afraid I don't know anything about Uncle Bjorn's business arrangements, Leif said. Perhaps you should speak with whoever handled his other affairs. Eric's laugh carried an unpleasant edge. He didn't have other affairs. Everything went through us. And now that responsibility passes to you, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Thorvald interrupted. Your uncle was part of our organization. He provided valuable services, and in return, we provided protection and market connections. His death doesn't end those obligations. The dog had moved to stand directly beside Leif, its hackles raised enough to be visible, but not yet enough to provoke open confrontation. The animal's positioning suggested it understood exactly what kind of men these were and what they represented. What kind of services? Leif asked, though he suspected he already knew. Information, Thorvald replied. Your uncle had a gift for learning about merchant caravans, wealthy households, vulnerable settlements. He knew when guards would be light, when treasures would be transported, when defenses would be weakest. He was a scout, Eric added with obvious pride in their operations' efficiency. The best we ever had. Made our work much more profitable and much less dangerous. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Uncle Bjorn hadn't been a raider himself. He'd been the intelligence source that made other people's raids successful. That explained the careful mapping, the systematic documentation, the focus on avoiding direct confrontation. He'd been selling information about his own people to criminals who used it to rob and terrorize innocent families. And now, Thorvald continued, with Bjorn gone, we need someone to take over his responsibilities. Family obligations, you might say. I'm not interested in continuing his work, Leif said firmly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Both visitors' hands moved closer to their weapons, and the dog's growl became more audible. I'm afraid that's not really your choice, Thorvald said quietly. You see, Bjorn had debts, large ones, and you've inherited those along with everything else. The only way to pay them off is to continue, providing the services we require, Eric's grin showed teeth that had been filed to points, an affectation that was meant to intimidate and probably succeeded with most people. Don't worry. It's easier than you might think, and much more profitable than honest work. As the two men departed with promises to return in a few days for his answer, Leif stood in the doorway, watching their boat disappear into the morning mist. The dog remained pressed against his leg, offering what comfort it could to a man who had just learned that his inheritance came with obligations that could destroy whatever remained of his honor. Looking down at his loyal companion, Leif made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Well, old friend, he said softly, it seems we have more digging to do. But this time, we're not looking for treasure. 3 days of intensive searching had revealed the true scope of Uncle Bjorn's activities. The dog had led Leif to 7 more burial sites scattered throughout the marsh, each containing treasures that spoke of systematic theft spanning many years. But it was the discovery in the 8th cache that changed everything. Not more silver or jewels, but weapons that told a far more dangerous story. The blood-stained battle-axe lay wrapped in oiled leather, its blade still sharp, despite years of burial. This wasn't a ceremonial piece or trading good, but a weapon that had seen real combat. Dark stains along the cutting edge had resisted all attempts at cleaning. Speaking of violence that couldn't be washed away by time or weather, even more disturbing were the other items buried with it. Mail shirts pierced by sword thrusts, a helmet dented by heavy blows, and fragments of shields bearing heraldic designs that Leif recognized. These weren't random pieces of equipment, but specific items that had belonged to known warriors, men whose disappearances had been attributed to raids by unknown enemies. The dog had been unusually agitated during this excavation, whining and pacing as each item emerged from the earth. When Leif lifted the axe to examine its craftsmanship, the animal backed away with obvious distress, as if the weapon itself carried memories too painful to bear. He wasn't just gathering information, was he? Leif asked his canine companion. Uncle Bjorn was there when these men died. He took these things from their bodies. The evidence painted a picture far worse than simple collaboration with criminals. The systematic collection of personal effects from fallen warriors suggested someone who had participated directly in their deaths, perhaps even orchestrated them. The careful burial of these items spoke of guilt, or perhaps the superstitious fear that the spirits of the dead might demand justice. That evening, as Leif studied the recovered weapons by firelight, he began to understand why his family had never spoken Uncle Bjorn's name. This wasn't merely about choosing a different path or making questionable alliances. This was about betrayal on a scale that threatened the foundations of their warrior culture. The axe itself was beautiful work, too beautiful for a common raider's tool. Its blade showed the distinctive pattern welding technique that only mastersmiths possessed, while the handle bore intricate carvings that marked it as the weapon of a wealthy and powerful warrior. Leif had seen its like only once before, in the hands of Jarl Sigurd the Bold, during a feast celebrating victory over Danish raiders. But Jarl Sigurd had vanished 3 summers ago, while traveling to a gathering of neighboring chiefs. His ship had been found drifting empty, its crew and cargo gone without explanation. The other Jarls had assumed Danish revenge or perhaps sea monsters, but they'd never found any trace of what had actually happened. Now Leif held the Jarl's personal weapon, blood-stained and buried in a marsh that no honest man would ever visit. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If Uncle Bjorn had been involved in Jarl Sigurd's death, then his criminal network operated at levels far beyond simple robbery. They were eliminating political figures, disrupting alliances, perhaps even influencing the balance of power between kingdoms. The dog had settled near the hearth, but kept casting nervous glances toward the weapons. Its behavior suggested intimate familiarity with these items. Not just recognition, but emotional connection that spoke of traumatic memories. Had it been present when these weapons were claimed? Had it witnessed the deaths of their original owners? A sound outside interrupted his dark contemplation. Not the gentle lapping of water or nightbirds this time, but the deliberate splash of oars cutting through still water. The dog's immediate alertness confirmed what Leif already suspected. More visitors approaching through the darkness. But these weren't the expected sounds of Thorvald and Eric returning for his answer. Multiple boats moved through the marsh channels, their occupants making no effort to approach quietly. Torches flickered between the trees, casting dancing shadows that suggested a much larger group than the 2 criminals he'd met earlier. Quickly, Leif extinguished the hearth fire and moved to the window. Through the grimy glass, he could see lights surrounding the longhouse, at least 6 boats forming a loose circle in the deeper channels. These weren't casual visitors or business associates. This was a coordinated operation. The dog pressed against his leg, trembling with tension but making no sound. Whatever was about to happen, his loyal companion understood the danger far better than he did. The lead boat approached the rotting dock with practiced ease. Its occupant, a tall figure in a dark cloak, stepped ashore with the confidence of someone who had done this before. Behind him came others, too many to count in the flickering torchlight, but enough to make escape impossible. "Bjorn," called the cloaked figure. "We know you're in there. It's time to settle accounts." Leif's blood chilled as he realized these people didn't know about Uncle Bjorn's death. They'd come expecting to find the hermit they'd dealt with for years, not his inexperienced nephew. That ignorance might be his only advantage, but it also suggested that whatever business they'd come to conduct was urgent enough to risk a night journey through treacherous marsh channels. "We have your final payment," the voice continued. And your next assignment? Don't make us wait. You know how impatient our employer becomes. Moving carefully in the darkness, Leif gathered the most damaging evidence: the blood-stained axe, Sigurd's helmet, and the maps showing family territories. If these people discovered what he'd learned about Uncle Bjorn's activities, his life would be measured in minutes rather than years. The dog followed his movements with perfect silence, somehow understanding the need for absolute quiet. Its behavior reminded Leif that this animal had survived in this dangerous environment for years, probably witnessing confrontations like this one many times before. "Bjorn!" The voice carried a note of irritation now. "Answer us, or we'll come inside and find you ourselves." Heavy footsteps approached the door. Through the thin walls, Leif could hear weapons being drawn and men positioning themselves around the building. Professional efficiency suggested these weren't common criminals, but organized fighters with military training. The door exploded inward with a crash that echoed across the marsh. Dark figures poured through the opening, torches held high to illuminate the interior. Their leader, the tall man in the cloak, surveyed the scene with obvious confusion. "Where is he?" demanded a voice that carried absolute authority. "Bjorn was supposed to be here." "Sir!" called one of the searchers from near the cold hearth. "No sign of recent activity. Place looks like it's been empty for days." The leader's torch swept across the room, illuminating dust patterns and cold ashes that supported his subordinate's assessment. But when the light reached the corner where Leif crouched with the dog, both man and animal held perfectly still, hoping darkness would hide them from casual observation. "Search everything," the leader commanded. "If Bjorn's gone, we need to know where, and find out if he left anything behind that might compromise our operations." As armed figures began methodically searching Uncle Bjorn's possessions, Leif realized that discovery was inevitable. His only hope lay in the dog's intimate knowledge of this marsh and whatever escape routes Uncle Bjorn might have prepared for exactly this situation. The animal seemed to read his thoughts, moving toward a section of wall where loose boards had been arranged to look permanent, but could actually be removed from inside. Uncle Bjorn had planned for the possibility of unwelcome visitors who wouldn't be satisfied with simple conversation. As Leif followed his guide toward what he hoped was freedom, he wondered if he was about to learn just how dangerous his uncle's secret life had really been. The hidden passage led through the longhouse's foundation into a network of tunnels that Uncle Bjorn had carved beneath the marsh over many years. As Leif crawled through the narrow space behind the dog, his hands encountered smooth walls that spoke of patient, methodical work. This hadn't been a desperate excavation, but a carefully planned escape route. Probably years in the making, they emerged through a concealed opening nearly 100 paces from the longhouse, hidden among the tangled roots of an ancient willow that overhung one of the deeper channels. From this vantage point, Leif could see the armed figures moving through his uncle's home, their torches casting violent shadows on the walls as they searched for evidence of where the missing hermit might have gone. The dog pressed close against him, offering warmth and comfort while they waited for the searchers to complete their work and depart. In the flickering light, Leif noticed something he'd missed before, a small leather pouch hanging from a cord around the animal's neck, so much a part of its appearance that he'd assumed it was merely a collar decoration. With careful fingers, he opened the pouch and discovered its contents: a folded piece of parchment covered in Uncle Bjorn's careful script, and a small locket made of silver and bone. The writing was difficult to read in the dim starlight, but gradually the words became clear. "To whoever finds this faithful friend," the message began, "if you are reading this, then my past has finally caught up with me, and I am beyond the reach of earthly justice. The dog has been my only companion in these final years, and he knows secrets that I pray you will use more wisely than I did." Leif's hands trembled as he continued reading. The letter went on to describe not criminal activities, as he'd expected, but something far more complex and ultimately tragic. "I was not born to be a villain," Uncle Bjorn had written. "But when raiders killed my wife and children while I was away trading, I found that grief and rage make poor counselors. I sought revenge against those who had destroyed my family, and in my quest for justice, I became the very thing I sought to destroy. The locket contained a miniature portrait of a beautiful woman holding a small child, with a boy of perhaps 6 years standing proudly beside her. Uncle Bjorn's family, lost to the kind of violence that Leif now knew his uncle had helped perpetrate against others. The irony was cruel beyond words. A man seeking vengeance for his family's death had enabled the destruction of other families, creating an endless cycle of grief and loss. I became skilled at finding information, the letter continued, because I understood the pain of those who had lost everything. I could identify vulnerable households because I had once been vulnerable myself. But somewhere in my quest for revenge, I lost sight of justice and became merely another instrument of cruelty. The dog watched patiently as Leif absorbed this revelation. Uncle Bjorn hadn't been a simple criminal motivated by greed. He'd been a broken man whose grief had twisted his moral compass until he couldn't distinguish between justice and vengeance. The knowledge made his crimes more understandable, but no less terrible. The treasure you have found, the letter went on, represents not just stolen wealth, but stolen lives. Each coin carries the weight of families destroyed, children left orphaned, communities torn apart by raids that I helped make possible. I buried it not to hide riches, but to bury shame that had become too heavy to bear. As the armed searchers continued their work in the longhouse, Leif read the most important part of Uncle Bjorn's confession, a detailed list of families who had been targeted based on his intelligence, along with their current locations and circumstances. The document transformed from a simple letter into something far more significant, a guide for making restitution. If there is any honor left in our bloodline, Uncle Bjorn had written, perhaps someone will use this information not to continue my work, but to undo it. The families listed here are those who suffered most from raids I enabled. They deserve to have their stolen wealth returned, though I know such gestures cannot restore the dead or heal all wounds. The dog's behavior suddenly became more urgent. Through the willow branches, Leif could see that the searchers had found evidence of the hidden tunnel. Torches were moving toward their position, and voices called out coordinates as the armed figures organized a systematic search of the surrounding area. Moving with surprising stealth for his size, Leif followed the dog deeper into the marsh channels, staying low among the reeds and using every bit of cover the landscape provided. The animal seemed to know exactly where to go, leading him through a maze of waterways that would have been impossible to navigate without an experienced guide. They found shelter in a partially submerged grove, where fallen trees created a natural blind. From here, they could observe the searchers without being seen, and Leif could continue reading Uncle Bjorn's letter by the faint starlight filtering through the canopy. The dog has been trained to reveal these secrets only to family, his uncle had written. He will know if you are worthy to inherit not my crimes, but my chance at redemption. Trust his judgment in all things. He has proven more loyal and honorable than the man he served. As if responding to this praise, the dog pressed closer to Leif's side. In the darkness, man and animal formed a partnership that felt both new and ancient, as if they were continuing something that Uncle Bjorn had begun, but never finished. The searchers spent another hour combing the marsh before their leader called for withdrawal. He's gone, the voice carried clearly across the water. Either fled or dead. Either way, our arrangement with him is finished. What about his replacement? Asked one of the subordinates. Thorvald said there was a nephew. We'll deal with that problem when we find him, the leader replied. For now, we have other sources. Bjorn was useful but not irreplaceable. As the boats disappeared into the darkness, Leif felt a strange mixture of relief and determination settle over him. The immediate danger had passed, but he now understood that his inheritance involved far more than hidden treasure. Uncle Bjorn had left him not just wealth, but responsibility, the opportunity to use stolen riches to heal wounds that his own family member had helped create. Looking at the dog in the dim starlight, Leif made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Instead of keeping the treasure for himself, or simply burying it deeper, he would follow his uncle's final guidance and begin the long process of returning stolen wealth to those who deserved justice. "Well, old friend," he whispered to his loyal companion, "it seems we have work to do. But this time, we'll be stealing from thieves to give back to victims." The dog's tail wagged once in the darkness, a gesture that somehow conveyed both approval and the promise of continued loyalty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Leif would not face them alone. He had inherited not just Uncle Bjorn's guilt, but also the one thing that had kept his uncle human through years of terrible choices: the unwavering devotion of a companion who understood the difference between right and wrong, even when his master had lost that distinction. As dawn approached, they made their way back to the longhouse to begin planning their first act of restitution. The treasure that had once represented shame and violence would become the foundation for healing and justice. It wouldn't undo the past, but it might help create a better future for those who had suffered most from Uncle Bjorn's tragic choices. The morning after the searchers' departure brought an unexpected discovery that changed everything Leif thought he understood about his uncle's legacy. While cleaning debris from the ransacked longhouse, the dog began exhibiting the same urgent pawing behavior that had led to the first treasure cache. But this time, the animal directed his attention not to the ground outside, but to a specific section of the stone hearth. Following the dog's persistent guidance, Leif discovered that one of the hearthstones could be moved, revealing a hollow space behind the fireplace that the previous night's searchers had completely missed. Inside lay Uncle Bjorn's most carefully guarded secret: not more treasure, but a leather-bound journal wrapped in waterproof sealskin. The first pages contained detailed records of every raid Uncle Bjorn had helped facilitate, written in a precise hand that suggested meticulous attention to accuracy. But as Leif read deeper into the journal, the true scope of his uncle's activities became clear, and the revelation was as shocking as it was redemptive. Uncle Bjorn hadn't been working for the raiders at all. He'd been working against them. "Year 7 of my deception," read one entry dated several seasons past. "Thorvald continues to believe I am his loyal scout, providing intelligence that makes his raids more profitable. He does not realize that every family I identify as wealthy and vulnerable receives anonymous warning 3 days before his attacks. Nor does he know that the easy targets I recommend are actually well-defended positions where his men will face trained warriors rather than helpless civilians." Leif's hands shook as he turned the pages, finding entry after entry that detailed an elaborate campaign of misdirection and sabotage. The criminal network that considered Uncle Bjorn their most valuable asset had actually been manipulated by him for years, their raids consistently failing or resulting in heavy casualties among the attackers. "The silver I bury comes not from innocent victims, but from the raiders themselves," another entry explained. "When Thorvald's men fall in battle, which happens with increasing frequency thanks to my intelligence, I claim their personal wealth before their bodies are recovered. Let their own greed finance compensation for those they have wronged." The dog sat patiently as Leif absorbed this transformation of everything he'd believed about his inheritance. Uncle Bjorn hadn't been a criminal collaborator, but an undercover agent of justice, using his position within the criminal network to protect innocent families and gradually destroy the organization from within. But the journal revealed even more startling truths. The blood-stained battle axe that had so disturbed Leif wasn't evidence of Uncle Bjorn's murders. It was a trophy taken from raiders he'd killed in single combat when they discovered his deception. Jarl Sigurd hadn't been Uncle Bjorn's victim, but his ally, working together to eliminate threats to their people's safety. "Sigurd grows impatient with the slow pace of our campaign," read one entry. "He argues for direct military action against Thorvald's network, but I convince him that patience will yield better results. We must eliminate not just the visible criminals, but their supporters, suppliers, and connections throughout the region. This requires careful planning, not heroic charges. The journal went on to describe a sophisticated intelligence operation involving multiple kingdoms and dozens of undercover agents. Uncle Bjorn had been just one part of a coordinated effort to identify and eliminate criminal networks that preyed on coastal settlements. His isolation in the marsh wasn't hiding from justice. It was providing the perfect cover for coordinating resistance activities. Most shocking of all was the revelation about Jarl Sigurd's disappearance. The powerful leader hadn't been murdered by raiders, but had faked his own death to go completely underground, taking on a new identity that would allow him to infiltrate criminal organizations at their highest levels. The blood-stained weapons weren't evidence of his murder, but props used to make his staged death convincing. Sigurd's funeral was a masterpiece of deception. Uncle Bjorn had written with obvious satisfaction. Even his own jarls believe he perished in a raid gone wrong. Meanwhile, he operates freely among the criminal networks of 3 kingdoms, gathering intelligence that will eventually allow us to destroy them all simultaneously. The dog seemed to approve of Leif's growing understanding, tail wagging as comprehension dawned. This loyal animal hadn't been guarding the shameful secrets of a criminal. It had been protecting the vital intelligence gathered by a hero whose sacrifice and dedication had saved countless innocent lives. Further, pages revealed the true scope of their success. Dozens of planned raids had been prevented through Uncle Bjorn's warnings. Entire criminal networks had been dismantled when their members walked into carefully prepared traps. Hundreds of families had been spared the grief that had originally motivated Uncle Bjorn's quest for justice, but the journal also contained troubling recent entries, suggesting that Uncle Bjorn's cover might have been compromised. References to increased suspicion from Thorvald, closer surveillance of his activities, and concerns that his network of contacts was being systematically eliminated. "I fear our time grows short," read one of the final entries. "Thorvald questions my recent intelligence failures, and Eric watches me with increasing hostility. If they discover my true loyalties, not only will I pay with my life, but years of careful work will be undone. I must prepare for the possibility that someone else will need to continue this mission." The last entry, dated just days before Uncle Bjorn's death, contained detailed instructions for his successor, information about ongoing operations, lists of remaining criminal targets, and most importantly, contacts within the legitimate government who could provide support and resources for continuing the fight against organized crime. "The dog knows everything," this final entry concluded. "He has witnessed every meeting, every operation, every victory and setback of our campaign. More than that, he can identify allies from enemies, truth from deception. Trust his instincts above all others. They have never failed me," looking at his canine companion with new respect and understanding. Leif realized that his inheritance was far more complex and significant than simple treasure, or even the opportunity for restitution. He had inherited an ongoing mission of justice that spanned multiple kingdoms and involved networks of dedicated agents working to protect innocent people from organized crime. The treasure caches throughout the marsh weren't shameful hordes of stolen wealth. They were operational funds, carefully accumulated resources that Uncle Bjorn and his allies used to finance their undercover activities. Every silver coin represented not theft from innocent victims, but justice claimed from those who preyed on the vulnerable. But inheriting this mission also meant inheriting its dangers. The armed searchers who had ransacked the longhouse weren't just criminals seeking a missing associate. They were enemies of a resistance network that had been systematically destroying their operations for years. If they discovered that Uncle Bjorn's nephew had access to his intelligence files, they would stop at nothing to eliminate both the information and its keeper. As Leif closed the journal and looked into the dog's intelligent eyes, He understood that his choice was no longer simply between keeping treasure and making restitution. He was being asked to continue a war against injustice that his uncle had fought in secret for years, using methods that required courage, cunning, and absolute commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The dog's steady gaze seemed to ask a single question: was he worthy of such trust? The detailed restitution list that Uncle Bjorn had maintained proved to be far more than a simple record of damaged families. It was a strategic document that revealed the full scope of criminal operations across 3 kingdoms. Each entry contained not just names and locations of victims, but detailed intelligence about the raiders who had targeted them, their current activities, and their connections to larger criminal networks. As Leif studied the carefully maintained records by candlelight, the dog settled beside him with the patient attention of a creature who understood the importance of this work. The list contained 43 families whose lives had been shattered by raids, but Uncle Bjorn's notes revealed that most of these attacks had been prevented or minimized through his intervention. The families who still needed help were those he hadn't been able to reach in time, or whose cases required resources beyond what one man could provide. The widow Astrid of Hedeby, read one entry, lost husband and 3 sons to Thorvald's raid on the fishing fleet. Currently living in poverty with her daughter, working as a servant in the household that once employed her husband as captain. Deserves restoration of husband's share in the fleet profits, approximately 400 silver marks, plus compensation for years of struggle. Each case told a similar story of lives destroyed by greed and violence, but Uncle Bjorn's notes also contained something more valuable than silver: detailed information about how to contact these families, how to verify their identities, and how to provide restitution in ways that wouldn't draw unwanted attention from the criminals who had originally targeted them. More importantly, the list revealed that Uncle Bjorn had already begun the process of restoration. Nearly half the families marked had notes indicating contact established or partial payment delivered, suggesting an ongoing operation that required completion rather than initiation. The dog had been guiding Leif not just to hidden treasure, but to an active mission of justice that couldn't be abandoned without leaving vulnerable people in continued danger. That evening, as Leif planned his first contact with the family on the list, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. Instead of its usual calm alertness, the animal became agitated, pacing near the windows and making soft, whining sounds that spoke of urgent concern. Its training told it something that Leif had missed. They were being watched. Moving carefully to avoid being seen from outside, Leif peered through gaps in the shutters and spotted movement in the marsh channels. Not the obvious approach of armed boats this time, but subtle signs that suggested careful surveillance. Ripples that moved against the wind, shadows that shifted when no one should be there, and the complete absence of the night sounds that normally filled the marsh after dark. The dog pressed against his leg, trembling with tension that communicated clearly immediate departure was necessary for survival. But fleeing now would mean abandoning not just the treasure, but the intelligence that dozens of families needed for justice and protection. Uncle Bjorn's journal contained information that could finish dismantling the criminal networks, but only if it reached the right people. Working with desperate efficiency, Leif began gathering the most critical documents. The family restitution list went into a waterproof pouch, along with Uncle Bjorn's journal and the contact information for legitimate authorities who could continue the work. The carved rune stones and maps he wrapped carefully and secured in a leather satchel that could be carried during a difficult journey. The treasure presented a more complex problem. Taking all of it would slow their escape and make them obvious targets for robbery, but leaving it might put operational funds beyond reach when they were most needed. The dog seemed to understand his dilemma, moving to specific locations where Uncle Bjorn had buried the most portable wealth, silver coins and small jewelry that could be easily transported. As they worked together to secure essential resources, Leif found himself thinking not about the danger they faced, but about the families whose lives depended on completing Uncle Bjorn's mission. The widow Astrid working as a servant in what should have been her own home. The orphaned children of merchants whose trading posts had been burned by raiders seeking easy profits. The elderly couple who had lost their life savings to criminals who specialized in targeting isolated farms. These weren't abstract victims, but real people whose suffering could be alleviated with the resources Uncle Bjorn had accumulated. More than that, they were people whose stories needed to be heard by authorities who could prevent similar crimes in the future. The intelligence Uncle Bjorn had gathered could protect hundreds of other families if it reached the right hands. The dog's urgent whining intensified, and through the shutters, Leif could see torches moving closer through the marsh channels. Multiple boats this time, approaching from different directions in a coordinated pattern that suggested military training rather than criminal opportunism. These weren't Thorvald's raiders looking for a missing associate. These were professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to get it. With practiced movements born of desperation, Leif secured the most critical documents against his body, while the dog gathered items in its mouth that seemed randomly chosen but probably represented years of learned priorities. Together, they moved toward Uncle Bjorn's escape tunnel, but the sounds outside suggested that their watchers had discovered this route during their surveillance. "Burn it," called a voice from the marsh. "Everything inside. We can't risk leaving." Evidence. The smell of smoke confirmed their worst. Fears. The longhouse that had been Uncle Bjorn's refuge for so many years was being destroyed to eliminate any trace of his activities. But more than destroying evidence, the fire would eliminate the operational base that dozens of resistance agents had relied upon for coordination and support. As flames began to consume the building above them, Leif and the dog crawled through increasingly smoke-filled tunnels toward an uncertain escape. The intelligence they carried represented years of dangerous work, but it would be worthless if they couldn't survive long enough to deliver it to people who could act on it. The dog led them not toward the obvious exit they'd used before, but to a different route that emerged near the deepest part of the marsh channels. Here, Uncle Bjorn had hidden a small boat loaded with supplies for exactly this situation: emergency rations, weapons, and most importantly, detailed maps showing safe routes to friendly contacts in distant settlements. As they paddled away from the burning longhouse, Leif looked back at the flames consuming his inheritance and felt not loss, but determination. The building was just wood and stone, but the mission it had housed would continue. Uncle Bjorn's work wouldn't die with his refuge. It would grow and spread until every family on that restitution list had received justice, and every criminal network that preyed on innocent people had been destroyed. The dog sat calmly in the boat's bow, watching their destination rather than the destruction behind them. Its behavior suggested not the end of something important, but the beginning of a new phase in a long campaign for justice. They had work to do, and people who depended on them to do it well. 3 days of careful travel through back channels and forgotten waterways brought them to the village of Hedeby, where the widow Astrid scraped out a living in the shadow of prosperity she'd once known. The dog had guided them unerringly through landscape that would have been impossible to navigate without intimate knowledge of hidden routes and safe harbors. Uncle Bjorn had trained his companion well for journeys like this one. The village itself bustled with the activity of successful trade, but Leif could see the divisions that prosperity created. Well-dressed merchants conducted business near the harbor, while poorer residents, widows, orphans, and the injured veterans of failed raids worked at menial tasks that barely provided subsistence. The social structure that elevated some while abandoning others was exactly what Uncle Bjorn's mission sought to address. Finding Astrid proved easier than expected. The dog seemed to know exactly where to go, leading Leif through narrow streets to a modest house where an elderly woman hung laundry that bore the fine weaving of someone who had once been wealthy. Her movements carried the careful dignity of someone determined to maintain standards despite reduced circumstances. "Astrid Eriksdottir?" Leif asked, approaching with the respectful caution that such conversations required. The woman turned, and her eyes immediately fixed on the dog with recognition that bordered on relief. "You're Bjorn's dog," she said softly. "I wondered what had become of you after—" She paused, studying Leif more carefully. "And you must be the nephew he mentioned. He said someone might come, but I'd begun to think it was just the rambling of a man who lived too much in hopes." Her knowledge of Uncle Bjorn's plans confirmed what the journal had suggested. The restoration process had been more extensive than Leif had realized. This wasn't his first attempt at making contact, but part of an ongoing relationship that had given this woman reason to hope for eventual justice. "He spoke of me?" Leif asked, settling on a bench outside her home where they could speak privately. Astrid's smile carried warmth tinged with sadness. "He came here twice, always with that faithful dog. The first time was just after my husband and sons were killed. I was angry, suspicious of any stranger who claimed to want to help. But he persisted, proved he knew details about the raid that only someone truly dedicated to justice would have discovered. The dog had positioned itself where it could watch. Both the conversation and the surrounding streets, alert for any sign of danger, but relaxed enough to suggest they weren't currently being followed. The second time," Astrid continued, "he brought silver, not charity but restitution. He explained that it came from the raiders themselves, wealth recovered from those who had destroyed my family. That made it possible to accept. It wasn't someone else's generosity, but justice finally served." From his traveling pack, Leif carefully withdrew a small leather pouch containing silver coins and a delicate brooch that Uncle Bjorn's notes indicated had been stolen from Astrid's home during the original raid. The family signet ring that, too, served as proof of his authority to complete this mission, gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, a symbol of legitimate inheritance and the responsibility it carried. "He said there would be more," Leif explained, placing the items in her weathered hands. "This represents your husband's share in the fishing fleet profits for the years since his death, plus compensation for what you've endured. It won't bring them back, but it should allow you to live with the dignity they would have wanted for you." Astrid's tears came silently, but her voice remained steady. "The money is welcome, but knowing that someone remembers them, that their deaths weren't meaningless, that means more than silver." The ring she examined with particular care, tracing its familiar engravings with fingers that remembered when it had adorned her husband's hand. "This was his father's ring, and his father's before that. I thought it was lost forever when those animals burned our home." As she spoke, neighbors began to notice the unusual gathering. Several approached with the cautious curiosity that such meetings invariably attracted in small communities. But instead of suspicion or jealousy, their reactions showed recognition and approval. "Astrid deserves whatever help she can get," said an elderly fisherman who had clearly known her family. "Her husband was the finest captain we ever had, and her sons were learning to be just like him. What happened to them was an injustice that demanded answering." Another neighbor, a woman carrying a basket of fresh bread, nodded agreement. "She's helped all of us over the years, sharing what little she had, even when she could barely feed herself. If someone wants to help her in return, they have our blessing." The community's acceptance of what might have seemed like suspicious generosity spoke to Uncle Bjorn's careful approach to these restorations. He hadn't simply appeared with unexplained wealth, but had built relationships and trust that made justice possible without creating new problems. As the afternoon wore on, Astrid shared stories about her lost family that helped Leif understand why Uncle Bjorn had prioritized her case. Her husband hadn't just been a successful fisherman, but a man who used his prosperity to help others, providing loans to struggling families, sharing his catch during poor seasons, and mentoring young men who wanted to learn seamanship. "The raiders didn't just kill 3 good men," Astrid explained. They destroyed a network of support that kept this entire community stable. That's why Bjorn's work mattered so much. It wasn't about individual compensation, but about healing wounds that affected everyone. The dog's sudden alertness interrupted their conversation. Its trained senses had detected something that human eyes missed, but the tension in its posture warned of approaching danger. Their peaceful afternoon of successful restitution was about to become something far more challenging. Looking toward the harbor, Leif spotted the problem. A familiar boat had just tied up at the dock, and two figures were disembarking with the confident movements of men who expected to find what they were looking for. Thorvald and Eric had tracked them to Hedeby, and their presence meant the mission of justice was about to become a fight for survival. The dog's low growl provided the only warning before Thorvald and Eric rounded the corner, their expressions shifting from determination to surprise as they discovered not just Leif, but clear evidence of the restitution activities they'd hoped to prevent. The silver in Astrid's hands and the family ring on her finger told a story that would have serious implications for their criminal operations. Well, Thorvald said, his single eye taking in the scene with calculating precision. The nephew has been busy, and using our property to play hero, I see. Eric's hand moved to his sword hilt, but his father's subtle gesture held him back. They were in a public place, surrounded by people who clearly supported what Leif was doing. Violence here would create witnesses and complications their organization preferred to avoid. That's not your property, Leif replied, rising to face them. It was stolen from these people to begin with. Stolen. Thorvald's laugh held no humor. That implies the original owners had any right to it. We simply redistributed wealth that was being wasted on people who couldn't properly defend it. The casual cruelty of this statement stirred murmurs of anger from the gathered neighbors. But Astrid's voice cut through the rising tension with surprising authority. I know you, she said, studying Thorvald with recognition that surprised everyone present. You were there the day my family died. You led the raid that destroyed everything we'd built. The admission was probably tactical error, acknowledging his crimes in front of witnesses. But Thorvald seemed beyond caring about such details. His focus remained fixed on Leif and the implications of what this restitution represented. Your family died because they lived carelessly, he replied with chilling indifference. They accumulated wealth without building proper defenses, then acted surprised when stronger men claimed what they couldn't protect. The dog had moved to position itself between the criminals and the gathered villagers, its hackles raised and teeth showing in a display that suggested it remembered these men and their capacity for violence. Its protective stance reminded everyone present that this confrontation carried deadly serious stakes. From his traveling pack, Leif withdrew Uncle Bjorn's most carefully guarded secret, a special key made of carved bone and precious metals that had unlocked his uncle's largest treasure cache. According to the journal, this key opened not just a single hiding place, but a network of depositories that Uncle Bjorn had established throughout the region as emergency funds for resistance activities. You're looking for treasure, Leif said, holding the key where both criminals could see it clearly. Here's the key to Uncle Bjorn's largest cache, worth more than everything else combined. Thorvald's eye fixed on the artifact with obvious greed, but Eric leaned forward with suspicious intensity. Father, it could be a trap. Why would he offer it so easily? Because, Leif continued, I'm proposing a trade. This key and the location of the final treasure cache, in exchange for leaving these people alone. Take the silver and go. Let the families keep what they've already received, and no one pursues you for past crimes. The offer hung in the air like a blade balanced on its edge. Thorvald clearly wanted the treasure, but accepting the bargain would mean abandoning their leverage over him and acknowledging that their criminal network had been compromised beyond repair. Astrid stepped forward with courage that surprised even Leif. In her hands, she held the family ring and the silver he'd just given her, offering them back with steady determination. Take it, she said quietly. Take everything if it means protecting others from what happened to my family. Some things matter more than personal justice. Her sacrifice galvanized the other villagers. One by one, they began offering their own valuables, anything that might convince these criminals to leave without violence. The community that had welcomed Leif's restitution efforts now stood, ready to give up their gains to protect him from the consequences of his generosity. But the dog's behavior suggested that generosity wouldn't be enough to resolve this confrontation. The animal's training told it something about these men that made peaceful solutions impossible. They weren't here just for treasure. They were here to eliminate the threat that Leif and his knowledge represented to their entire operation. Eric's patience finally snapped. "Enough talking," he snarled, drawing his sword. "We'll take the key and kill everyone who's seen too much." Problem solved. The movement triggered instant chaos. Villagers scattered for cover, while the dog launched itself at Eric with trained precision that spoke of Uncle Bjorn's careful preparation for exactly this situation. But even as the faithful animal fought to protect innocent people, Leif realized that violence here would defeat everything Uncle Bjorn had worked to accomplish. These people had suffered enough. They deserved justice, not another tragedy that would leave more widows and orphans in its wake. With the key still clutched in his hand, Leif made a decision that would either save everyone present or cost him his life. "The cache is in the old burial ground north of the marsh," he shouted over the sounds of struggle. 300 paces from the standing stones, buried beneath the largest oak. "Take it all, but leave these people alone." Thorvald's eye gleamed with triumph as he called off his son's attack. They had what they came for, and killing witnesses would only complicate their retreat. But as they departed with their prize, Leif wondered if his sacrifice had truly saved lives or simply delayed a reckoning that was always inevitable. The key was gone. But its real treasure, the knowledge of how to continue Uncle Bjorn's mission, remained safe with the people who would use it wisely. 3 months later, Leif stood at the edge of what had once been Uncle Bjorn's marsh refuge, watching the dog investigate the ruins of the longhouse with the patient thoroughness that had made him such an invaluable guide. The burned timbers had settled into the soggy ground, leaving only scattered stones and memories of the man who had lived and worked here in service to justice. But they hadn't returned for nostalgia. Hidden beneath the largest foundation stone lay Uncle Bjorn's final gift, a carved blessing stone that his journal had mentioned but never fully explained. The dog had led him directly to it, as if this last pilgrimage had always been part of their shared mission. The stone itself was unremarkable, a piece of local granite carved with runes that spoke of approval, inheritance, and the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. But its significance went far beyond the simple words etched into its surface. This was Uncle Bjorn's final message, a spiritual inheritance that completed the transformation of shame into honor, of criminal legacy into heroic mission. "To my heir in blood and purpose," the carved message read, "you have proven worthy of trust I dared not hope would be honored. The treasure you traded for peace was empty, old pottery and river stones, wrapped to look valuable. The real wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away in service to others." Leif smiled despite himself, remembering Thorvald's rage when the criminals had discovered the deception 3 days after their departure from Hedeby. By then, Leif and the dog were far away, continuing their work of restitution with resources the criminals never knew existed. Uncle Bjorn's final trick had given them the time and safety they needed to complete their mission properly. The months since that confrontation had been filled with journeys to scattered settlements where Uncle Bjorn's list guided them to families who deserved justice. Each stop had brought its own challenges and rewards. Elderly parents reunited with treasures they thought lost forever. Young widows given resources to rebuild their lives. Children provided with inheritances their fathers had earned but never been able to claim. But more than individual restitution, their work had begun to heal communities that had been fractured by years of criminal predation. Word spread from village to village about the mysterious pair who traveled with silver and stories of justice, creating networks of hope and mutual support that made future raids far more difficult to execute successfully. The dog had proven invaluable in ways that went beyond his knowledge of Uncle Bjorn's secrets. His ability to sense danger, identify trustworthy people, and provide comfort to those who had suffered trauma made him an essential partner in work that required both practical skill and emotional wisdom. Together, they had developed an efficiency that Uncle Bjorn, working alone, could never have achieved. In the small town of Ribe, they had reunited the merchant gunner with the silver arm rings that had been stolen when raiders burned his trading post. The man wept openly as he held the rings that had belonged to his grandfather, explaining that their return meant more than the wealth they represented. It meant his family's honor had been restored. Near the Danish border, they found the farming family who had lost their seed money to a raid that Uncle Bjorn's intelligence had failed to prevent in time. The silver they provided didn't just compensate for past losses, but enabled the family to expand their operations, eventually becoming prosperous enough to help other struggling farmers in their region. Most satisfying had been their return to Hedeby 6 weeks after the confrontation with Thorvald and Eric. Astrid had used her restored wealth not just to improve her own circumstances, but to establish a fund that provided assistance to other widows and orphans in the community. The ring that had been her husband's became the symbol of an organization that continued Uncle Bjorn's work of turning individual justice into community healing. He would be proud, Astrid had said when they visited her thriving household, where she now hosted regular gatherings for people who needed support and guidance. Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've done it, with wisdom instead of vengeance, building instead of destroying. The dog had seemed to understand her praise, accepting the attention of grateful children with the dignity of a creature who knew its work had meaning beyond simple loyalty to one master. It had found a new purpose that honored its original training, while expanding into something larger and more hopeful. Now, as they prepared to leave the marsh for the last time, Leif reflected on how completely his life had changed since that desperate morning when he'd first arrived at Uncle Bjorn's longhouse. He had inherited not just wealth, but wisdom. Not just treasure, but the knowledge of how to use it in service to something greater than personal comfort. The criminal network that had once terrorized coastal settlements had been effectively dismantled. Without Uncle Bjorn's supposed intelligence, and with their operations repeatedly exposed to authorities, Thorvald's organization had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Word from reliable sources suggested that both Thorvald and Eric had met violent ends when their remaining associates blamed them for the network's failures. But more importantly, the communities that had been their victims had begun to heal and strengthen themselves against future threats. The silver that Uncle Bjorn had accumulated through years of dangerous work had been transformed into something far more valuable: hope, justice, and the kind of social connections that made people safer and stronger than any individual wealth could accomplish. Standing beside the ruins with Uncle Bjorn's blessing stone in his hands, Leif understood that his inheritance was complete. He had received not just material wealth, but spiritual wealth. Not just opportunity, but responsibility. Not just a dog's loyalty, but a partnership in work that would continue as long as there were people who needed protection from those who would exploit their vulnerability. Looking at his faithful companion, who sat watching the marsh channels with alert contentment, Leif made a decision about their future that felt both surprising and inevitable. "Well, old friend," he said softly, "I think it's time we started training others to continue this work. Uncle Bjorn's mission is too important to depend on just two individuals. No matter how dedicated we might be." The dog's tail wagged once in the fading afternoon light, a gesture that somehow managed to convey approval, understanding, and excitement about the challenges that lay ahead. They had learned that the greatest treasures weren't things you could bury in the ground. but relationships you could build with people who shared your commitment to justice and community. As they walked away from the ruins toward their boat, Leif carried Uncle Bjorn's blessing stone, but left behind the shame and isolation that had defined his uncle's later years. The work would continue, but it would be shared among many hands and many hearts, creating something stronger and more lasting than any individual effort could achieve. Behind them, the marsh settled into its eternal rhythms of water and wind, holding its secrets while the world above continued its ancient dance of loss and healing, destruction and hope.